Thanks very much for the invitation. I did say to John McAnulty a couple of weeks ago that given the date that we're going to do this on, I'd either be coming here to give a jubilant description of the victory or an incisive description of the defeat. And I'm actually not going to do either, because there has neither been a victory nor has there been a defeat of the revolt in Colombia yet, although it has suffered a major setback in recent days. So, I mean, the first thing to say is this revolt, very much like its Chilean equivalent, and I was actually in Chile a month before the revolt kicked off there, has taken everybody by surprise. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw this trade union bureaucracy, certainly didn't see it coming. And nobody expected when it started for this to last as long as it did. Least still the reformist politicians who were initially, after the first day of stoppages, were initially calling for it to continue. And then when it did, lost their bottle and started asking for the strike to be lifted. So one of the first things I have to explain, of course, is that the terminology, we use the terminology here, strike, but it's not actually a strike as you would understand it in European or North American terms, right? It is not a work stoppage. It is not a cessation of production by workers. Now, I'll explain in a minute. Doesn't mean there hasn't been a cessation of production. It just hasn't been called by the trade unions. And it's not due to workers going out on strike in support of these demands. Now, in general terms, what caused this revolt? Well, you can, like with many things, go back to, overarching this discourses about neoliberalism, the opening up of the economy in the 1990s, the semi-privatization of healthcare in Colombia. We still have a public health system, but it's run by private companies who are subsidized by the state to do so. And then there's the knock-on effect in terms of privatization of major industries, state bodies, the knock-on in terms of employment, and also the running down of the educational system. The educational system is receiving a similar budget now to what it used to receive in the 1990s, even though the number of university students, for example, has tripled. So you can have that sort of overarching discourse, but that doesn't actually explain why now. And there are a number of factors. One is that the young people who are out in the streets, they are living without actually necessarily being conscious of these decisions taken back in the 1990s. They are living through, they are suffering the effects of them. A very high rate of unemployment, and also a very high rate of what is called here subemployment. What does that mean? Well, it means you might get a few hours work on a particular day. It means you might be selling stuff. It means you might even be collecting scrap, collecting refuse, etc., or have jobs that last a few days, a month, etc., etc. And there's a whole swathe of the population live like that, where income, when we count per capita income in lots of Colombian cities and neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, you come up with a really, really low figure. Like, for example, $50 per person per month. You're going to go, well, that's not livable. Nobody could possibly live on that. And they don't. So what happens is you have parents, their children, and in some cases, even their grandchildren, all living in the same house. And everybody's chipping in their $50 worth to get by, to get through the end of the month. And we have a huge part of the population that's living in those circumstances. And this started before the pandemic. We had big protests in 2019 in relation to another tax reform that the Colombian government put forward. That was cut short by two things. A, the trade union bureaucracy began to demobilize it. And then COVID kicked in, and initially people were quite fearful of the virus and fearful of what could happen to them. But what we've seen through the pandemic is people are dying in their thousands. People are not getting proper health care. And so it doesn't really matter. For the mass of the population, the virus is a possibility that may kill them, but the actual reality of poverty is a daily grind that they have to deal with. So, people have lost that fear. But also we're talking about a generation that never knew the fear of the dirty war. It's unfortunately living through it now and learning very fast the nature of police violence, because we're now on around day 50, 52, and we have about 80 people who've been murdered by the police. We have over 100 people who are still disappeared. We have hundreds of people who have been injured, many of them with gunshot wounds to the eyes, a very deliberate tactic of the police. So we have this generation that didn't know this, that had never lived through it, because the dirty war in urban areas, you can't really say it ended, but all the major operations, the major onslaughts were over and done with at the beginning of this century. So it's a generation that didn't actually know this. That's one of the characteristics actually of this revolt, is the conflict in Colombia has always been urban and rural. But for various reasons, the urban aspect, the guerrillas were pushed out of the cities. Social movements in the cities suffered greater repression and were disbanded. But this conflict now around the tax reform, whether it's tax reform, pension reform, work rights reform, health reform, it wasn't just, the tax reform was the first of the measures, which basically they put VAT on everything except VAT on water, but no VAT on Coca-Cola. So they put VAT on everything, but there was a whole series of packages that were coming through. So what we have is an urban revolt, principally urban revolt, which has caught everybody by surprise. A lot of the left has spent the last 3 or 4 decades romanticizing rural struggles, romanticizing indigenous struggles, to the detriment of anything in relation to urban struggles, even though the statistics show that there are more urban struggles every year than rural ones. They just happen to be smaller, more localized. There are no major demands involved. This one obviously there's a huge difference. And so what we had is that during the pandemic, and I don't really know what the confinement was like in Ireland, but here, the first few months, it was absolute. And given that most of the population live on a day-to-day basis, if you don't work today, you don't eat tomorrow. Whole sections of the population found themselves with no income, no way of earning an income, and no state subsidies. And when they protested, the riot police were sent in to deal with them. And throughout that whole period also, despite the fact that it was technically illegal to evict anybody, there was a protection on rental evictions. The mayor's office here in Bogotá, for example, had no problem in evicting wholesale entire communities from poorer areas in the southern part of the city. So, you have that whole period, all the neoliberal reforms and everything that it produced leading up to just before the pandemic. You have an absolutely dire situation during the pandemic where people literally cannot earn a living and are still expected to pay rent, still expected to pay electricity, water, etc., etc. A militarization of the cities in contravention of the legislation, because despite Colombia's reputation, the military actually have no role in policing, formally, no role in policing. In practice, they may do, well, practice they do, but not in a major city like Bogotá, but they were actually mobilized during the pandemic. And so we get to the end of this tax reform, and this comes along after a whole series of scandals where the government ministries are spending money left, right, and center on luxury items and very public, conspicuous consumption. New bulletproof cars, new riot tanks. That was a major, at the time that the mayor's office here in Bogotá was saying there was no money to subsidize poor people during the pandemic. She went and spent an absolute fortune on new riot tanks and new weaponry. This Venom, which launches everything from stun grenades to exploding rubber bullets. It's quite similar to what the Israelis use to launch grenades on Palestinian neighborhoods, except here what's being launched is what they call, they don't even call it non-lethal. It's the technical term in Spanish is a reduced lethality. So she spent an absolute fortune on that. And then at the same time that the finance minister says we're broke and he needs to raise 30 trillion Colombian pesos, he goes and spends exactly half that amount on new jet fighter aircraft for the Colombian military. And in the previous tax reforms, they had given new tax exemptions to multinationals. And also as part of their pandemic package, they took roughly $1 billion out of the public exchequer to give to the banks during the crisis. And what they said was, well, what you do if you're hungry is you can ask the banks for a loan to get through the pandemic. And rather than us give you the money, we're going to give this money to the bank, who will then loan it to you and charge you interest on it. So we had a whole series of measures taken by people. We almost have a sort of a parody of European royalty before the bourgeois revolutions, conspicuous consumption. And we also had our Marie Antoinette moment of let them eat cake. The Minister for Finance, as part of his justification for increasing taxes, he said that the Colombian minimum salary was very high. It's only $200 a month, a little over $230 a month. He said it was very high, and he went through a whole series of things that you could buy with this minimum salary, and every last one of his calculations was wrong. And our let them eat cake moment here is in relation to the price of eggs. He couldn't even get that much right, and a lot of people were quite angry. People actually are having difficulty getting to the end of the week, getting to the end of the month to eat. And this man thinks that they're spending a pittance on food because food is cheap in his calculations, when people actually know what the reality is. Now, the trade union bureaucracy, they had this national strike committee, and they called the first protest for the 28th of April. And initially, when we call these what they call strikes, what the trade union bureaucracy means is that the bureaucrats go out and march, the students go out and march, and the NGOs go out and march, and some workers go on strike, and then we all go home. That has been the standard practice now for the last couple of decades. It didn't happen because this time around, when we talk about young people mobilizing, we're not talking about students. We are talking about people who haven't finished secondary school, most of them, have absolutely no hope of ever getting to university. And it doesn't matter what reforms are introduced over the next year or even over the next 5 to 10 years, they're not going to university, and they're quite well aware of it. There's a very famous interview here where a young lad of 17, and he was arguing with the Secretary of Government in the mayor's office here in Bogotá. And he was very, very eloquent and angry. And he was saying, I'm 17. My life's over. I have nothing. I will have nothing. I won't have a job. I won't have a house. I won't have healthcare. And he says, and I want to have all of these things. So we're talking about a whole layer of people who, they're not students, like I say, and they're not organized workers. They're youths in poor working class neighborhoods who have nothing, and they have no hope. And it's one of the characteristics that despite the levels of violence meted out against these students, are still going out onto the streets. Now, these students are not organized, weren't organized, but they copied the Chilean model into what they call frontline, which are the ones that you see going out with the shields, the frontline, second line, and third line defense of demonstrations. They also mobilized progressive healthcare workers to tend to injuries and stuff like that. And they began to form coordinating committees within their own neighborhoods, then coordinating committees within the cities, and also now between cities. It is to some degree almost an anarchist dream, because there's no central organization of this. And they're still there. And despite the, like I said, the levels of violence meted out against them, they're still going out. Only yesterday, in the south of Bogotá, in Usme, the police shot dead a young demonstrator on taking part in the protests. And they shot him dead. They shot a gas canister at a short distance into his chest, but that's not actually the only form of repression. Police have actually been using assault rifles with telescopic sights on them. They've been arresting people and disappearing them. And one of the cases now, which is doing the rounds, is that yesterday in Tuluá, which is quite close to Cali, which has been the epicenter of the protests, a young lad's head, he had been arrested by the police, his head turned up in a black plastic bag. The obvious message for that is to frighten protesters, because the state now actually feels that it's got the upper hand. From the first day of the protests, the left reformists, such as they are, were calling for the protests to end. Duque initially said that he would withdraw the tax reform. Now, he didn't actually initially withdraw it. What he did was he suspended its progress through Congress. And they asked for the protest to be lifted. But the protests actually intensified because these young people were blocking streets, they were blocking highways all over the country. And this is when I said there's no cessation of production. Well, there was, because the young people were blocking factories, not the workers, the young people. They were stopping raw materials going in and stopping finished products coming out and circulating throughout the country. Eventually, the state had to negotiate humanitarian corridors with these young people in order to let food and medicines travel between the different regions. But the left bureaucracy, the trade unions, were really, really fearful of this, because it was a movement of people who had no hope and nothing left to lose, and were quite willing to go out and take on the police, even though the police, they were going out with stones, and the police were coming out with machine guns and firing live rounds at them. And the pressure began to mount to call off the strike. And eventually, and this is one of the weaknesses of this movement, it is, like I say, an anarchist dream. And that has been its strength, actually, in the sense that the central bodies haven't been able to manipulate it. But because it has no other leadership of its own, central leadership and spokespersons of its own, Eventually, the National Strike Committee decided to suspend major protests and blockades. Hasn't quite worked in its entirety, and protests are still going on, but the major blockades of highways and stuff like that, and the damage to capitalist production, that has gone down enormously. And no sooner did they do that, then the Colombian government took advantage of this and pushed through various elements of the different reforms it wanted to do, and basically told them the government's line is, well, we've won now. So the left reformers said to the students and the young people, if you suspend these protests, we're going to put in a law, a bill to Congress to abolish university fees. They did. It was voted down. All of them were voted down. And if the attempts at political control over the police and the army for their part in the murders, all of these have been voted down. So where we are now is a situation where the bureaucracy has no stomach for struggle. The left parliamentarians, they have, some of them actually, to their credit, didn't initially. They were instrumental in denouncing the violence that was happening on the streets, and they're also producing reasonably good analysis of the government measures. But the main one, Gustavo Petro, from day one, he saw this in terms of the presidential elections next year, and he was quite clear. He said he wanted the strike to end, because the more violence in the streets, according to him, the more likely it would be that there would be a right-wing candidate next year, despite the fact that his vice presidential candidate is going to be a guy called Roy Barreras, who has been a loyal supporter of Uribe first, and then of Santos. He's been on the right of the political spectrum his entire life. He is either going to be the presidential candidate with Petro as the vice president, or he will be the vice presidential candidate. They basically, what they said in the internal consultation, whoever wins goes to the presidency, and the other one is the vice presidential candidate. So he's been playing it in terms of electoral politics the entire period, and it's actually likely to backfire on him. None of these youths are going to turn out and vote for him. They've been listening to him. They've been getting attacked by the police. They're still being attacked by the police. And he has had little to say to them except lift your protests, call off the blockades, go back home. And his new is the new mobilization of the youth has to be to go to the national register and register their ID number for voting, right? He's playing it all within the institutions and has shown no stomach to challenge them. And like I say, he is playing for the elections next year, even though, thanks to the pandemic, we now realize that the elections, well, not that we always suspected this, but we now have the proof that the previous elections were stolen. When the pandemic started, Duque issued a whole range of subsidies that you could apply for. Those subsidies were all taken up within hours. It was done, you applied online. And when they looked at who got them, we find all of these fake national ID numbers were receiving the subsidies. And then when they checked these fake national ID numbers that had received state subsidies, it turns out they all voted in the previous election. These are for people who are either dead or non-existent. So Petro has wanted to just play within the institutions and has spent the entire month and a half, condemning the youths, condemning their violence, and equating state violence with the violence of the youths, although the state violence is rarely mentioned by name. So we're now at a situation, like I say, where the youths have refused to call off the protests. They are still mobilizing, but not with the same energy as before. And that's partly because, a month and a half, almost 2 months of protests, wears anybody down. That was the government strategy. It was also the left bureaucrats and the reformist left's strategy as well, to wear the youth down, so as we get to a stage where people actually only think, well, next year I'll vote in the elections for Pedro, and leave everything as it is. Until then, he has absolutely no desire to challenge the status quo. But there's still a lot of anger in the country, particularly around the issue of state violence. We've only had one prosecution of the murders of the youths. And the reason why we had that prosecution is the captain who shot the student, the youth, he wasn't a student, the youth, dead. He tried to blame it on a lower ranking police officer. And so it was in the context of a dispute between them, both of them, over who actually shot the kid, that this case actually moved forward to court. But all of the other cases, none of them have moved forward. And, you know, some of these killings have been caught on camera. The police cooperating with paramilitary groups openly in the streets of Cali has all been filmed, has all been caught on camera. Their ID numbers are there, and nothing has, there'll be no moves made against them. Pedro's strategy and his offer to the youth is wait till next year. But the last, and with this I'll finish, the last protests in 2019, we also had youths killed for whom nobody has been prosecuted. Last year, we had a lawyer tortured and beaten to death in a police station. The officers involved in that have yet to be, well, charges are going forward in their case, but they haven't been tried yet. And 13 other youths were shot dead in the city of Bogotá alone by the police, and none of those cases have gone forward. And people are quite conscious that when the protests are called off, then it's all over, that the elections are not going to solve anything. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you'll have more in-depth questions about it.